Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you are all well and safe at home. My name is Francisca Brito Pereira. I work at Nova SP in the Executive Education team, and my role today is going to be the host of this webinar. So before we start and I introduce Milton Souza, first I would like to share with you some technical details of today's session. So on the bottom of your screen, you can see the tool device, and on the tool device, you can see the Q&A and the chat. So the chat should be used only for technical questions, like if you cannot see the screen or if you cannot hear the speaker. If you have any questions for Milton Souza regarding his presentation, please do it on the Q&A. This session is being recorded and is going to be shared online on the site of our campaign. I believe that you probably already know the campaign, and it was on our website that you enrolled for this webinar. But if not, we are going to share the site with you on the chat, and please go there and look for a role, because our campaign is totally connected with today's webinar, and searching for our role is also searching for our meaning. So without further delay, let me introduce you Milton Souza. Milton is our associate professor at Nova SP, and his main research is around leadership and organizational behaviors. So now the stage is yours, Milton. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Francisca, and welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'll be conducting this webinar in the next few minutes. Let me first start by sharing the presentation with you, and then we can start. Hold on a second. Okay, so I believe you can see it now. Let's just open this up. So, so again, thank you for this opportunity to be with you in this moment. I'd like to introduce briefly the theme for today, and of course, as you can imagine, given the circumstances that we are facing, we think this is a rather appropriate topic for us to address. We thought that it would be useful to bring a more of an academic perspective or a bit of the science of meaning for us to be able to make better sense of what we're now facing. So a disclaimer already here, there's no silver bullets in this presentation. It's not like we're going to give you the formula for solving all your problems and all your anxieties. But we trust that by providing a bit more of information and knowledge about what meaning is and what is not, and what we know from about meaning, maybe that will give you some guidelines or cues for what you can do to address these times. So I'd like to start off by sharing two stories about meaningful lives, if you want, that I think will be quite representative of some of the topics we'll be addressing later. A few years ago, I came across this story from this British soldier in 2014 that decided to volunteer to go and fight against ISIS in Iraq. And as you can recall, this was not that unusual. You saw a lot of people doing the same. But what was quite interesting about this case, when I read it, was that this particular soldier had just his firstborn child was just born, and even then he convinced his wife that he wanted to go to Iraq despite that, to fight against ISIS. And the rationale he gave to his wife was that he didn't want to see his daughter to grow up in a world where children were being sold or raped or made to drive suicide vehicles into villages. And then he was able to convince his wife. And it is a rather interesting story to see how far people can go in this search for meaning and in providing some sense of purpose to their lives. So here you have this dichotomy almost between Ben as the family man or Ben as the soldier, but it just goes to prove the importance of meaning in people's lives and how much it can guide us in terms of how we behave. We'll come more to about this idea in terms of the difference between happiness and meaning. But this is the first story that I'd like to share with you. A second story that is a bit closer to home. Some of you might know of Johnson Smirdu. He is the founder of a rather positive initiative in Amadora called the Johnson Academy that basically tries to help youth avoid risky type of behaviors that might lead eventually to becoming criminals. And this is of course based on his own experience, because Johnson was for many, many years a convict, and he was imprisoned for about 10 years. And he was really a troublemaker, one of the hardest prisoners we ever had in the country. And he transformed entirely his life, of course, gradually, so that he could make his life to good use and also put his experience to good use in helping youth overcome the difficulties that he had and to aspire for a better life. And in these two cases, you see that there's something about the way we engage in reality, basically around the idea of providing meaning to what we do. These two stories, just to give a bit of a warm up, we don't have that much time, so I need to be a bit fast, but just to give you an idea of the importance of meaning in our lives, in everyone's lives. Moving to the next slide here, this might provide already some clues into what this thing called meaning is, right? And this is a word from a psychologist called McAdams. And basically he depicts the way we construct our meaning on these sort of three pillars. The first one is, of course, a lot of what we do is, of course, dependent on our personality, things we're born with. As we grow up, we develop values and motives and goals, which are adaptations to our environments. And on top of those two things, we create narratives, we create stories. And what we know from research is that meaning is very much associated with this linguistic capacity that human beings have. And this associative process that we're continuously building in our minds about reality around us. So we are continuously in the process of telling stories. So this idea of meaning is, in essence, a fluid process of continuously constructing who we are. So it's not something tangible, something you find and this is it. It's an ongoing fluid process of telling a story about who you are. So you are in a continuous process of selfing, if you want. We might not be aware of the stories we're telling, but we are continuously in this mode of self-storytelling. And this is how we develop our identity and how we develop our life stories. So, and in these two cases, it's the transformations, the transitions they did was about reinventing or retelling the story in a way that made sense for them and that provided meaning for them. So let me continue now. This was just a bit of an introduction to the topic on a very important matter here, which is this difference between meaning and happiness. And often people use this almost interchangeably. And we know from research, empirical research, that they're actually two separate things. They are related, but yet they're separate. And this is something that we would like to spend some time with now. There was a poll we actually did. I don't know if Gonzalo, you can already share some of the results that we have from that poll, because the poll also highlights some of the differences between meaning and happiness. Gonzalo, can you show that? Let me see if you can see results. Yes. So just to see some of the answers that we got so far, when people talk about whether their lives make sense, most have a relatively high score there. If they think that when they answer about whether they have a purpose that they actively pursue, here is a bit less obvious. But still a big proportion of people, about 31%, are in full agreement with that. When they think about whether if life is worthwhile living, the vast majority is totally in agreement with that. When we go into whether people feel happy, the overall sentiment is relatively high, and that people also are actively trying to search for meaning. And what is also interesting then to see is that if they would look at their life 6 months ago and how they look at their lives today, quite a number of people would think that 6 months ago, before this whole crisis, their lives made more sense. I will tell more about this in a bit, in terms of, because there's a rationale behind these various questions here, but we can tell that there's already, people will answer this differently. And in some cases, people will say my life is meaningful, and yet they might say that their life is not entirely happy, or the opposite. So let's get a closer look into these two notions of meaning and happiness and see how they differ. So I take a quote here from Ralph Waldo Emerson, that he talks about the meaningful life, and again, not necessarily happy. And he said that the purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well. So what we see is that you might have a meaningful life, but not necessarily a happy life. And in fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson even goes as far to say that that shouldn't even be your main purpose, to be happy, but instead to have a meaningful life. In opposition to that, we have here another quote from Lucius Seneca that talks about the happy life. And here he refers to something totally different. Basically, he mentions that happiness, or true happiness, is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future. So there's a state of joy, if you want, of enjoyment, of being stress-free, of not caring about other things, that is momentaneous eventually, but is not necessarily meaningful. So you see that the two can coexist, and we can think of situations where meaningfulness leads to happiness, but they're not necessarily the same. All right. So if we want to be a bit more academic, Roy Baumeister talks about these two notions in more exact terms. He basically says that meaningfulness is a cognitive and emotional assessment of whether one's life has purpose and value, while happiness is a subjective well-being, a state of well-being, as an experiential state that contains a globally positive, affective tone. And you can already tell a few differences from these various quotes and definitions. I will outline that a bit more specifically here in the next slide, which is about the difference between happiness and meaning according to 4 key variables, as laid out in a quite extensive research that Baumeister and his colleagues did with hundreds of people. And one important difference is that when we talk about happiness, it's mainly present oriented, right? So your mainly concern is the here and now. And people that report higher levels of happiness basically refer to the present moments. Where meaning, when people refer to their lives as being meaningful, is in essence about the integration between past, present, and future. Again, this goes back to the idea that meaning is about storytelling. It's a story that you tell about whether your life makes sense given your past, also your biology, and also at the same time what you're doing today and sort of goals you might ambition for the future. The other thing that they noticed that from this research is that when you are in this happy mode, you are in essence with a taker type of attitude. And this idea of givers and takers is coming from the work of scholars like Adam Grant and others. And takers are mainly self-centered, and you're trying to take the most from the situation they're in as much as possible. While when you are in a meaningful sort of experience, you might still have a sort of a taker orientation, but in many ways, in many cases, is actually the opposite. When you are more centered on giving rather than taking. So the attitude is different there as well, or in essence, it can be fundamentally different. An important thing they found out in this research as well is that a sense of happiness had no correlation with senses of worry, stress, and anxiety, while it had a very strong positive correlation with meaning. In other words, people who report that their life is meaningful actually say that they worry more and have more stress and more anxiety. So if you choose for meaning, you're not choosing the easy path. Let's put it this way. This is probably what he says. But still people want to strive for it because it matters, because it gives purpose and gives a sense of meaning for people. And by the way, there's been also interesting research about who is the happiest, if it's families with children or singles. And in fact, we have enough evidence that people who are single and have no kids, not single necessarily, but they have no kids, report higher levels of happiness, while people that have children report lower levels of happiness and yet more levels of meaningfulness. So just to see that the two are not necessarily related. When it comes to the fourth variable that we found in this research, that when you are in this experiencing happiness, you have no concerns with identity or self-expression. And when you are experiencing sense of meaningfulness, these concerns about identity and self-expression are very high. So you see, just to clarify the difference between the two, and this also goes to where we face the situation we face today, wherein, I mean, given the pandemic and all the crises we're in, we're probably in a moment where happiness is probably harder, but there's a lot of opportunities for meaning. And this is also a matter of how you rethink your life, how you rebuild your narrative about your own life in this given context, so that maybe you're not necessarily happy, but at least you can enrich your life with more meaning. This is something we'll come back in a bit as we continue. So let's go a bit deeper into this notion of meaning in life. And this is a very important slide here, because we're not talking about the broader philosophical question of the meaning of life. And there was a whole range of philosophers working on that, especially in the 20th century. We had a branch of philosophy, of what we call existential philosophy, where people like Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard basically dealt with this bigger question: what is the meaning of life? We even have a Monty Python movie called The Meaning of Life. But that's not what we're dealing with here. We're talking about the subjective psychological experience of meaning in life. In other words, how do we build meaning in our lives, not the fundamental question, the philosophical question about the meaning of life. But let's go a bit deeper into what is this idea of experiencing meaning in life. And there are basically three ways of experiencing meaning in life. I mean, maybe there are more, but at least what research has been showing is that we can maybe think of three possible ideas here. One, which is more of a cognitive process, this is idea of coherence. And in essence, this is our sense that our life makes sense, right? And we had a question in the beginning about that. Now, does our life make sense? Is it comprehensible, right? Is it somehow logical? And this is more of a cognitive process. And this is one thing we found out, that this need for coherence is also can be associated with a survival instinct, because we want to create a mind map of the world where things are somehow stable and we can rely on, so it reduces uncertainty and therefore increases our chances of survival. So maybe there's an instinct here about the need for coherence. Whenever we see that the world around us is not coherent, we have difficulties with that. And so we sense that our life is less meaningful because of that. So it might be that if you are, this is particularly true if you're put in a new circumstance, a new condition, suddenly your life loses sense and it's not so comprehensible, and it makes your life a bit more difficult. I experienced that when I moved from Portugal to the Netherlands in 1998 for the very first time and went living there. And I experienced this big contrast between the mind map that I had of the world while living in Portugal, where I come from, and the new reality of a Protestant society, which was very different. So I had a situation of confusion for a while, and it was hard for me to make sense of the world. Of course, then you can learn and adapt, but it takes time. So that's one particular way of experiencing meaning. The second one is this idea of purpose. And this is not so much a cognitive process anymore, it's more of an emotional process. It's how we set goals and aims and provide direction to our life, you know, again, it connects past, present, and future, just like coherence does, but it kind of guides our actions. So a way of experiencing meaningfulness is through purpose. Often we talk about meaning and purpose as being the same thing, but they're not. So purpose is one way of experiencing meaning, and purpose, of course, can contribute to creating coherence, but they're separate things. But it's a difference, it's part of meaning, but it's not the same as meaning. Okay, so that's one way of experiencing our life as being meaningful. The third one, which is a more recent addition when it comes to meaning, is this idea of significance. And it's in essence this idea that life is worthwhile living, and that there's intrinsic or inherent value to meaning, to life as a whole, and that is, we should, you know, we should invest in our lives and we should be happy with our lives somehow. And this is also close to the ideas of ikigai in Japan or eudaimonia in Greece. And this is this idea of human flourishing. And in fact, there's been research apparently showing that Japanese communities that have a strong sense of ikigai or significance live longer and healthier than in other parts of the country. So there's something to say about this experiencing meaning as life being significant. So if you think about these three ways of experience meaning, and again, they're not the same, but they are obviously correlated. We have this three-party arrangement of meaning that we know of: coherence, purpose, and significance. If you look at the coronavirus and the effect on meaning, and of course this is just something we're now learning and exploring, but we've had many cases before where people face uncertain crisis situations, which of course disturbs your world and affects your sense of meaning. So how does that work in this case? First thing, obviously, there's already quite a lot of research as we speak, basically demonstrating that this virus is having quite an impact on our mental health. So about half of the Americans, and this is just from this week, report that they are suffering with mental health issues. And there's a significant increase of people reporting that since this crisis. And on the right side here, you can see how the Italians, this is research from March 24, so about 2 weeks ago, not even, showing that in this sample of more than 3,000 people, the vast majority of the Italians report very high levels of anxiety. So you see, and we had enough cases before, also with SARS, and it's of course not only the fear of the virus and what it will do to our lives, to our economy, to our careers, to our jobs, but also the quarantine effect of isolation and not being able to connect, that is changing, of course, many things and creating this anxiety. In my view, when you think about these three aspects of meaning, the first thing that this virus has changed dramatically is this sense of coherence. Suddenly life is not coherent anymore. The things you used to take for granted suddenly are not there anymore. You cannot go to the gym, you cannot go to work, you cannot take your kids to school. The routines you had are no longer there. So this lack of coherence is the first direct impact of the coronavirus. Suddenly things are out of place. And that of course creates anxiety because you're dealing with the uncertain, and that uncertain is potentially a threat to your survival. So there's an instinctive reaction there. And of course, because we are continuously searching for meaning, so the search for meaning, the drive for meaning is intrinsic to us. We're trying to find anchor points. But because we still don't know how this will unfold, the sense of losing some sense of meaning remains. One of the things, for instance, we found out as well is that what probably bothers people a lot when it comes to this quarantine is not so much that they are in quarantine, it's also not knowing when it will end. Again, it's this lack of awareness, lack of this uncertainty about the world and how it will unfold that creates this anxiety. So it goes right to the core of this lack of coherence. I have a quote here from Descartes that talks about this as well, as you feel like you're in this sort of whirlpool where you cannot neither stand nor on the bottom or swim to the top, right? So you're continuously in this swirl and you don't know how to get out of it. And that's probably what we feel. And of course, it's important to stay informed, but as I'll come back later, not too much, because otherwise I can increase the levels of anxiety. But gradually we'll be able to create a sense of the new normal as we unfold in the situation. Also interesting to see that this drive for meaning is so important, that you see a whole bunch of things happening out there on these three pillars. So in terms of significance, you have this phenomenon of people singing on the balconies and playing music and applauding the healthcare forces in whatever way they can. And this is, in my view, a way of ensuring that life is still worthwhile living, is to have to bring in some sort of sense of this still makes sense. It's still worthwhile the effort of fighting for our lives, and there's a purpose also to this. So, but that significance, I think, plays quite an important role, and that's an example, an illustration of that. On the other side, you have thousands and thousands of people standing up and volunteering to help in in multiple ways. And that, of course, is very much around the ideas of purpose, feeling that you can contribute, that you can actually add value, that you can help others. And also, and I put a quote here, the tweet from Donald Trump just recently, when he was saying that he would do everything he could to save the American businesses and industries. And he talked about this Chinese virus, for which he was very much criticized. But again, you can see that people go to great extents to keep their worldview consistent. And this is, again, this tweet is exactly an effort from Trump for himself maybe, but also for the country, to keep a sense of coherence so that things still make sense for him, so that his worldview doesn't change. And you see that he had a tough time in the process, and he was trying to resist the whole idea that, you know, this reality was even there to start with. But we try to defend our worldviews because that gives a sense of comfort and a sense of coherence. So this is just an illustration of how people try to still extract meaning from the circumstances in multiple ways, because we need to have a sense that our lives still are meaningful. The consequence of not doing that is that you feel lost, all right? So I'm not defending what Trump said there, by the way. I think that's eventually corrected his course and started adapting, but just to see how people react to this situation now. And you may feel or experience similar things on your own accounts. So what does science tells us about what could be pathways to a meaningful life? Again, there's no silver bullet in here. Many of the things I'll be saying here maybe won't be that spectacular, and they will sound normal. The trick often is not knowing about these things, is committing to this. But in essence, you can think of 4 basic pathways, and I'm oversimplifying here, of course. Here's a conceptual model that talks about 4 different ways to get to a more meaningful life. And it divides between agency, and basically agency is a fancy academic word for being active, doing things, and the other one, the communion, and that's the sense of connection, right? And the other variable is about whether you are focused on the self or focused on others. So if you combine these 4 variables, you have basically 4 quadrants. One tells about getting a sense of meaningfulness through contribution, or another word for that could be purpose, and is basically, what do you do to help others? How do you contribute in whatever circumstance you're in for the people you care about, so that you get to extract a sense of contribution. The other one is a sense of individuation, or if you want, of becoming better at something, of investing in yourself to become more competent, become more knowledgeable, to be the best, whatever it is that provides and gives a sense of direction. But it's again about doing something, but focused on yourself. On the lower side, you have communion with self, which is about being authentic, is about being principled, is about, despite the crisis, despite the problems, I'm still principled and centered, and I know who I am, and I work and live according to those values, and I don't let the situation basically put me off track. And they need to find ways eventually here of self-expression, and I'll give you an example in a bit. And the other path is through unification, is by communion, by connecting with others that we care about, so that we have a sense of shared values and shared destiny, if you want, in the process. So these are four basic pathways. They're not independent. You can have them kind of coexisting, but there are people who steer more and drive and extract more meaning on each one of these four different. So these are some quotes from well-known scholars on these various forms of getting to meaning. I will skip this too also for the sake of time. I'd like to spend some more time with this one. This is Viktor Frankl. I don't know, maybe some of you already read his work. He was a psychologist that was also imprisoned in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. In that experience, he actually developed his own philosophy, his own psychology of what he calls logotherapy, which centers around the idea of meaning. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he saw that people, even in the most adverse circumstances, even when they are in a situation of life and death, where it's not guaranteed they will be able to survive when they wake up in the morning, even then people strive for meaning. So he even basically challenges the whole idea of Maslow's pyramid, that the basic needs that we have are food and shelter. He actually thinks that a fundamental need we have is meaning, even at the cost of food and shelter if necessary. And it's interesting because he says, talking about contribution, that too often we spend too much time thinking about ourselves and what we want for our lives and what life should bring to us. And paradoxically, what he says is that the more you forget about yourself, the more you dedicate somehow to others, the more you actually self-actualize. So in that process of finding your purpose, you should maybe spend 80% of your time being out there, really trying to contribute to others, and only a small portion of time, just enough for you to reflect upon your values and what you care about, but don't spend too much time thinking about yourself. So there's a paradox. The more you focus on self-actualization, the more impossible it becomes. So self-actualization is a side effect of self-transcendence. And this is an interesting observation that I think may be also valuable in this particular context, is that maybe we need to worry less about ourselves and maybe a bit more about others. It doesn't have to be people out there suffering from coronavirus, but there's a lot of people around us who probably need help. So that's an interesting observation here that I'd like to share with you. Just to give you a few famous examples of people that I think roundabout fit into those boxes. I mean, our well-known Ronaldo, for the Portuguese in the webinar, is a clear example of someone who finds purpose in his life and meaning in his life through this sense of agency focused on the self. He still, of course, relates himself to others, but also from the perspective of being the best, being at his best, always progressing, always winning the next match. And it's always a very strong self-centered agency effect. Not to say that he's egoistic, it's not the same thing, but his main driver is being better all the time, developing skills, developing strength, scoring more goals, whatever it is. On the right side, you have someone like Mandela that extracts meaning not from that agency, self-centered agency, but on the other-centered agency, contributing towards the nation, building up South Africa, fighting the oppression of racism and all that. But it's all this sort of my life at the service of something greater than myself. So I'm very much in line with what we saw just now. On the bottom right corner, I would say maybe Mother Teresa would be a good example. Of course, you still see a sense of agency, but a sense of communion with others is probably the main driver that characterized her life. And I mean, if I want to think about someone who was in a really enforced quarantine for about 2 years, escaping from the Holocaust, of course, is Anne Frank, and Frank in Amsterdam. She spent 2 years in a really confined space, and the only thing she had was a little window to the outside, and in order to stay sane, a process of self-communion, of self-reflection, and expressing herself through her diary. That was the only way of extracting meaning from what would be otherwise a meaningless life. And so that's, for me, also in these times where we are almost forced to stay at home, the reminders that our situation is not as bad as it could be, When we look at someone like her, a teenager that was able to extract so much meaning from her life based on this process. Some examples maybe closer to home or maybe more recent. So this is Laura Decker, the 14-year-old that sailed around the world a few years ago.
Milton, I'm
Yep.
sorry, it's been very, very interesting, but can you wrap up a little bit because we are a little bit delayed in
Okay.
terms of, thank you.
Sure, I will accelerate. So these are some of the examples, and I'll be happy to share with you more about this. So what can you do? I think that's, again, there's no silver bullet, but I think it's a matter of choice. And I think you can choose for meaning. So don't, happiness now might be harder, but meaning, there's plenty of opportunities to look for meaning. The first thing I would like to say is that you need to embrace and accept the new normal. That coherence, that normality you are used to, eventually will need to be reinvented. And we are continuously building that up. But embrace the fact that you cannot go back to how things were. There will be a new normal and you need to accept it. The other thing is, don't read too much news, because that will increase your level of anxiety. Just enough for you to know what's going on, but not to become obsessed with the data and how many people by the minute are dying or not. And then there's looking at these 4 paths. Contribution. What are the little things you can do to help others at work, at home, in the community? And again, going back to Viktor Frankl, forgetting a bit about yourself might be a way to get more meaning. And in the individuation path, maybe you want to learn something new. There's plenty of online courses, MOOCs and Coursera can maybe, or even Nova. What you're doing now with a webinar, start a small home or artistic project, build a new bookshelf, or whatever it is, something that you can develop a new skill, learn guitar, whatever it is. Self-connection, maybe it's a good time to reflect on your values, be more mindful, learn to appreciate the small things, so create time to be on your own as well, which might be hard in this time and age, but maybe at home with your family to agree on how can we create a few minutes for each one of us. And then the unification, and I think this is almost goes without saying, the good thing that we have digital technology today. Spend quality time with loved ones, share past stories, because as we saw, meaning is about connecting past, present, and future. So share the stories, spend the time with the people you care about and you love. Don't be working all the time. Sometimes when you're working from home, you just end up working all the time. So make sure they create space there for you to be together and really enjoy your time together. Again, these are obvious things, but often is that we just forget about it. We need to reframe our lives accordingly. Final words, this idea of psychological capital, we can apply it also at home. As leaders at home, we can create a sense of hope. There will be a better day in the future, and I think we need to emphasize that. Stimulate learning within your family, have people learn new things as we discuss, build relations of support to overcome the crisis and to build resilience, and have a positive, optimistic view of this reality. There are good things about this as well that we can extract from this. Of course, there's a lot of sadness, but there's also a lot of opportunities here for us to reinvent ourselves and to rethink our lives. I'm rushing. I could spend more time with this, but we have no time. Final quote from Viktor Frankl: meaning is a choice, right? And you always have that freedom to choose how you'll respond to your circumstances. This is what he observed in the concentration camps. Those prisoners that chose for meaning had a better chance of survival than those who didn't. So those who give up died more frequently than those who didn't. If you want to be part of a study on meaning in work, you can reach out to me, because we're conducting a larger study involving various countries about the effect of meaning in the context of work. We'll be more than happy to explore that with you. Reach out, and we'll be here to help. And that's all for now. Thank you.
Milton, thank you very much. This was very, very interesting, this webinar. I particularly enjoyed the difference between happiness and meaning. I always thought that meaning could conduct to happiness, and it was interesting to understand that might not be the case. Sorry for the rush, but I wanted to guarantee that we still had time to do at least 1 or 2 questions. I hope you still have time to answer them. So for the participants, thank you very much for all of you that attended. It was a pleasure. So now we are going to start the Q&A session, and I will read 2 of the questions that you put on the Q&A of the chat. So the first one is, how can we achieve a happy and meaningful life? So the idea here is that if it is possible to have meaning and happiness, how can we achieve that balance?
No, absolutely, it is absolutely possible to have the two. I think that not saying that they're not the same, that doesn't mean that you cannot coexist. So you can have a meaningful life and a happy life. So meaningfulness does not necessarily come at the expense of happiness, although if you choose for a more purpose-driven, meaningful path, that will always cause worries and anxiety. It's unavoidable, right? It's not an easy path, which does not say that in those moments in that path, there won't be moments for happiness. But that probably means that you need to be more, create times to be more mindful, to be more present, to be more in the here and now, and maybe less on concentrated on whatever purpose you're trying to derive. So this is definitely possible, but you need to be disciplined so that you are also able to concentrate on your purpose, but also on your meaning, but also at the same time on the present and the happy.
Thank you very much, Milton. And apart from that, I would like to know, apart from the book that you recommended by the end of Viktor Frankl, participants would like to know if you have other recommendations in terms of books or articles that they could read to have a kind of enlightenment in terms of meaning, because sometimes people face some strong difficulties in understanding what is their true purpose or meaning. I know that meaning and purpose is not the same, but at least to help them finding their meaning.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of reading you can do. I wouldn't recommend, and I did that for a while, and I think it's useful from an intellectual perspective to read things like Nietzsche or Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, because they had in a way a strongly nihilistic view of life, which is not always the most positive, although still valuable. But there's a whole branch of humanist or positive psychologists that can be very useful. One particular book that I like a lot is a book by Rollo May called Man's Search for Himself, where he gives a positive sort of idea about human potential and how you can find and create meaning in your lives in various forms. I would definitely recommend that book from Rollo May, but there are others, and I'll be glad also to share and maybe to also release some articles or some references for your at your own time for your reading.
Okay, Milton, thank you very much. Just to end our Q&A session, how do you think companies can help people in this search for meaning?
So one of the things we know for sure, and this is very much in line with the idea of meaning, is this theory of self-determination. And people are at their best when they can determine their own objectives, when they can find environments where they can flourish and grow and develop new skills. So organizations need to create more of an empowering culture, to trust people more, to give more freedom for people to define how they want to work, to craft their jobs so that they become more meaningful. It's important that there's a stronger sense of autonomy and competence if you want people to feel that their work and their lives therefore are more meaningful, and that calls for more of an empowering leadership style. The good news is that an empowerment leadership style also contributes to agility. So you have a two-in-one. You have more motivated people and more agile organizations. Of course, easier said than done, but that would be the basic recommendation for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Milton. Thank you very much, everyone that attended to this webinar. I remind you that the webinar had been recorded and we will have it online on our website. You can you can see the websites on our chat. And I strongly recommend you to go there every day, because we are always putting news over there, and you can see the other webinars that we are going to do further on this week and on the following weeks. Thank you very much once again. It was a pleasure, and I invite you to start thinking about your role to play in these times of uncertainty and anxiety. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.